Hey everybody, it's Brian Trippe. I'm right here in Birmingham, Alabama. Haven't made a video in a few days. I've got a lot of stuff kind of in the hopper that I'm working on. Went out and looked at some properties with a few other investors and a few other folks here recently. So I'm editing those videos now, and we're going to have a lot of really good videos here in the coming weeks. But I haven't done a video in about a week, so I wanted to try to get something out to you guys. I had a couple people asking me after our last meeting about subject to. I mentioned it very briefly, and so now I want to kind of give a full explanation of what it is and how you could potentially use it in your own real estate business. So subject to is just it's kind of a slang term for buying a piece of property subject to the existing financing. So if there's already financing in place, whether it's bank financing, it could be owner financing, whatever, if there's already financing in place, you just essentially take that financing over. Now there's a big difference between that and actually assuming a loan. This is not assuming a loan. When you do an assumption, the bank or the lender actually knows about it. With a subject to, the lender really doesn't know about it, and so it becomes very risky. It becomes risky for you, the buyer, and it becomes the investor, and it becomes risky for the seller. It becomes risky for the person who actually owns the property. So when you take over that financing, the financing piece stays in the seller's name. So if there is a mortgage in place, that mortgage stays in that seller's name, and it could stay in their name for the entire life of the loan. So you got to make sure that you tell them that. But the property itself changes hands, and actually you own that property. And I'm not going to get into this piece of it because it becomes really complicated. So everyone asked me the question, well, how can you do that? You can't sell a piece of property. Almost every mortgage has a clause in it. It's an acceleration clause. If you sell a piece of property, then if the lender finds out about it, they can demand the note becomes due. The whole entire note becomes due. So the way to get around that, we're not going to really talk in detail about this because it's really kind of for your attorney to tell you, but you got to put it in a land trust. It's the only way you can really do it. So it's a federal law that anyone can put any piece of property that they own into a land trust. So what you're going to do is you're actually going to put this property that you're going to buy subject to, you're going to put it in a land trust first, and then assign that land trust to your entity, your LLC, or even your name as the beneficiary. So you now kind of technically, or your LLC technically owns that property, but the bank never finds out, or the lender, whoever the lender is, they never find out because it was put into a land trust. And all they know is that it's in the land trust. So I'm actually going to, I want to go through, I give this to everybody. I'm going to put this up on the screen. It's the agreement and statement of understanding. This is, I make every single time I do a transaction like this, I make sure that the seller is 100% aware of what's going on. And I'm just going to go through these one by one. So, and I can send this to you if you want me to send it to you. It's no big deal. And this is just to make sure that they understand what they're getting themselves into. So just going through these one by one. The buyer is buying the property and will own it. So again, like I said earlier, you own the property. The seller no longer owns the property. They own the mortgage. So number two, the buyer intends to make a profit on the property, just kind of disclosing to them what's going to happen. The buyer is buying the said property subject to the existing financing. That means that any current loans will stay in the seller's name and on their credit report. They will not be assumed. It's not an assumption. So this is very important to make sure they understand, because sometimes, and I'm 100% transparent, they've got to know that if they need this loan to be cleared off their credit report in order to get another loan, then you cannot do this. You cannot do this transaction. So you got to make sure that they're aware of that. The mortgage will stay in the seller's name until it's paid off or assumed by a future known or unknown purchaser, and it may stay in the seller's name for the entire life of the loan. You got to make sure that they understand that. The mortgage on this property does contain a due on sale clause, which means that the lender has the right to call the entire note due and payable upon transfer of title. Again, we put safeguards in place to where that won't happen, but nothing is guaranteed and nothing is 100%. So you got to make sure that the seller is aware of that it's not 100%. The buyer intends to make the payments. So you're now going to make the payments on time every time if the house is occupied or has been damaged. So we're agreeing to that. The buyer has not represented itself as a debt relief agent. You got to make sure that you're telling them that you're not going to help them repair their credit. That's just another kind of piece of this. The buyer has not charged any fees to the seller for buying this property. Number 9, the buyer has not offered to rent or sell the house back to the seller for any amount. The seller agrees, and this is very important, that they will not change, draw money, borrow money, etc. against this property. It's very, very important that they don't do that. And what you can actually do is you can file all this paperwork at the courthouse, which you're going to do anyway, because you're going to go through a formal closing, because the property is going to sell. It is going to change hands. So you're going to go through that formal closing. So those documents will be recorded at the courthouse. And then number 11 here, the seller holds the party accepting the conveyance harmless and blameless from any. So just make sure you're kind of covering yourself. So I do all this and I say all that. I do this to make sure that they understand what they're getting themselves into. It's very, very difficult to do a transaction like this because there's some there's a lot to this, and it's very risky from the seller's vantage point. I've actually only done this one time, very successfully, but I've only done one of these transactions ever. This is not something that people are typically comfortable with unless they just are in a pinch. A lot of times, instead of using subject to contracts anymore, I actually do the option stuff. I do option contracts instead of subject tos. Kind of gets the same thing done. It's just it protects the seller a little bit better. It's kind of better for both. So I do that instead. And if you missed that, I talked about that a couple of weeks ago, but I'd be glad to get you those notes if that's something you're interested in learning more about. If you have any questions, definitely leave them in the comment box. I explain this to you the best I know how and the best that I've done it to my ability. So if you have any further questions, you really need to reach out to an attorney about a transaction like this, because this is a little bit more creative. But I hope you guys learned something, and I'll see you next time.